When leaders in the faith use God's word to manipulate others, they can do eternal damage. That's why we're confronting this topic head-on during this series. Today is part 3 of our series on spiritual abuse, and we'll be comparing the leadership of Jesus versus abusive leaders and what that means for us. We've got some really good stuff in today's episode, but first we want to go to part 3 of a conversation we had with our friend Lara, who was a person who experienced spiritual abuse. So let's go to that right now. I think it's interesting. You were just talking earlier about the pure expressions of love that you experience. And then on the flip side, this abusive leaders and the lording, the power. It just strikes me that there seems to be like a lot of talk from spiritually abusive leaders, but not as much action. Like if you were to look at the fruits of people's, position or their faith, like there's just a lot of things on the top that are not fruitful.
Yes.
I don't know if that's true from your perspective.
And that's definitely what was happening with a lot of these situations where there wasn't fruit. There wasn't...
Or loving action.
Yeah, there was not. If you looked at a lot of their lifestyles and their actions with us, it was more of just having meetings and correcting and the things that I would come up with, a lot of the ideas I'd come up with. I mean, I've had multiple times where I'd come in with an idea and it would be squashed in a way that it was like, it was just a way to say, we're going to keep you in your place, woman, or there'd be other times where they would say, we'll have our wives do it, but you're not going to do it. Just like I said, these are the types of things like, why would you do that? Like if you're in a healthy place where you're, and so there was, I know towards the end, there are a lot of the leaders, some of those leaders, there wasn't much activity of like Christ-like behaviors, loving, serving, like some of these leaders, many of them in the beginning were very, like you said, there's always the good that you remember a lot of times too. And there was so much good, right?
Yeah.
But then I think as their hearts, whatever, and it's even a charge for leaders, and it puts the fear of God in me, because I'm to speak clear too, that I've led many in this behavior, in this way. And I have repented to as many as I can. I've asked for forgiveness and changed my ways, because I understand it wasn't like, it's because of them that I've acted this way, but it's like wanting to grow and be a better leader, because I have a responsibility on earth to lead people well. And so how can I best do that? And understanding that, that just look at Christ. What is he like?
Yeah.
What are some of those ways? And continually, work towards that and have the fear of the Lord,
Wow.
Thanks for joining us for session 3 of The Great Cover-Up, where we're discussing spiritual abuse. We're Evan and Jenny Owens, founders of Reboot Recovery, parents of 3 crazy boys, and we're barely hanging on most days. Give me all the coffee. So for real, thank you so much for being here. You make it all worth it.
That's right. And we actually literally have coffee that we're drinking in real time.
Out of the shot, yep.
Out of the shot.
During the last episode, we talked about the mechanisms that enable spiritual abuse to thrive and why so many of us in the church allow it to continue. So to recap, we described the 4 mechanisms, which included positional authority, false teaching, isolation, and classism, and how these things are deployed to foster an environment where controlling and manipulative behaviors can be normalized. In these environments, abusive behaviors are often dismissed as rare, one-off occurrences, rather than allowing people to recognize a pattern that's developing. This probably sounds familiar to you because we've seen this play out on the national stage, where those closest to a celebrity spiritual teacher ignore blatant abuse in the name of preserving the good work that's being done.
Right. And, I'd like to let them in on kind of a little insight about us that really we haven't talked about much. In the earliest days of our work in Reboot, we made a choice and continue to kind of choose daily, quite honestly, that we wouldn't become narcissistic leaders. Way back, all the way in 2012, we had the opportunity to start kind of promoting ourselves alongside the work that God was doing. We had opportunities to almost share in his glory, so to speak, by building a platform around our brand. And that was some of the advice that we got. And for a brief period of time, me, Evan, I kind of tried, but God blessed me with the gift of limitations. And my attempts at being the center of the universe led to compassion fatigue and then ultimately burnout. And at the time, what seemed like a curse was in fact a blessing. Wow. Because that burnout forced me to stay largely in the background. It forced me to start focusing on empowering other leaders to do more and step forward. And from that burnout was born the decentralized reboot model that exists today all over the world, right? Where we've got volunteer leaders stepping forward to lead courses. So we made a decision, instead of saying, hey, Evan and Jenny have answers to trauma. If you need help, come to Clarksville, Tennessee. We were able to say, go down the street.
Right.
And that was a big shift for us. And I want to bring it to modern day because I want to be really transparent and sort of honest with you, right? That the longer that I'm around sort of the Christian mega ministry world, the more skeptical, or some might even say I'm cynical at times, because there are these absolute giants in the faith who do truly love Jesus with all of their heart. But you know what? There's also these people who are experts at self-promotion. And sadly, as Christians, we've become obsessed with following influencers who are more interested in building brands than they are building disciples. And I'm not saying that out of condemnation, because that temptation is very real. Sure. And it isn't all their fault, because the people around them are constantly asking them to become something that only God can be for those people. And even as we began our work on our book that we have coming out in September, right, every publisher's first few questions were things like, how many followers do we have? Yeah. How many email subscribers? How big is your following? Tell us about your platform. And I got to tell you, content, substance, our character, really those weren't much concern to people. What really mattered is how many people hung on our every word. They wanted us to be spiritualized self-help gurus. And how scary is that? Because we love our gurus. I mean, nowadays we don't call them gurus, we call them influencers, right? We want influencers, gurus that we can follow. That person who's going to lead us to wholeness, to happiness, to freedom. And I'll say that, this temptation for us is something that we still battle, but it's not new, because even way back in ancient times, instead of calling them gurus, instead of calling them influencers, they looked to kings. And in 1 Samuel, we read of how the Israelites demanded a king. Yeah. Now let's set the stage a little bit for them here, Jenny. So here's the backstory, right? Samuel is getting old, and his sons don't have the leadership chops they need to be able to step up and lead. And so the people come to Samuel and they say something like, give us a king to judge over us. So Samuel hears this, he takes it to God, and God says something that's extremely important for our discussion today. He tells Samuel this, he says, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them.
Wow. Do you see that shift? They rejected God from being king over them because they wanted a substitute. They stopped following God and they started following a king, an earthly leader. And I think Samuel knows that this is not going to end well. He warns them that a king is going to reign over them harshly and mistreat them. He tells them that this king will take the best of what they have to give. Their children will be taken and become warriors, and he'll take 1/10 of their grain for himself. He'll make them work to fulfill his bloodlust and personal goals. In other words, he'll build his platform on the backs of the people, using their time, talents, and treasures to set up for themselves, for himself, riches on earth.
That's right.
But the people don't listen. So it takes years for them to wake up and see what's happening. One bad king after another, just read the books of Kings and Chronicles, makes them realize that a self-centered, war-hungry king isn't the answer. And later, the prophets call out the injustice of Israel's elders and spiritual leaders who put wealth and power over authentic worship and sacrifice. But the people continue to elevate those religious leaders. In the New Testament, they're called Pharisees. The name Pharisee literally means separated ones. These people tended to be dogmatic religious teachers who saw themselves as above reproach, superior and pure. And anyone who challenged them was dismissed as being demon-possessed, a child of the devil, or enemies of God. In Matthew 23, Jesus really gets into it with a group of Pharisees in what some translations call the 7 woes of the Pharisees. I mean, he really goes after them. I mean, you read that, Jesus was not pulling any punches, saying that they talk a good talk, but they don't live it. He says that they demand total obedience from others, but they themselves are far from godliness. The Message puts it like this: instead of giving you God's law as food and drink by which you can feast on God, they package it in bundles of rules, loading you down like pack animals. They seem to take pleasure in watching you stagger under these loads and wouldn't think of lifting a finger to help. Their lives are perpetual fashion shows, embroidered prayer shawls one day and flowery prayers the next. They love to sit at the head of the table at church dinners, basking in the most prominent positions, preening in radiance of public flattery, receiving honorary degrees, and getting called doctor and reverend. Don't let people do that to you, put you on a pedestal like that. You all have a single teacher, and you are all classmates. Don't set people up as experts over your life, letting them tell you what to do. Save that authority for God and let Him tell you what to do. Man, that's so good. Here we see Jesus attacking the mechanisms of positional authority, false teaching, and isolation. And he continues by attacking classism in verse 11, saying, do you want to stand out? Then step down. Be a servant. If you puff yourself up, you get the wind knocked out of you. But if you're content to simply be yourself, your life will count for plenty.
I mean, we could stop right there.
Eugene Peterson nailed it. So good.
Boom. Boom. Right? I mean, this is the thing that, like, we could stop there and just let that speak to, is that what we see? Is that what you're seeing at your church right now?
I love the image of this sitting at the head of the table.
Right.
Like surrounding by the influencers, the prominent people.
Right.
But Jesus was there for the people who were outside who weren't even invited to the banquet, right?
That's right. And let me ask, is that what you're seeing at your church? Do you see a leader who's not puffing themselves up, but who is being a servant? Do you see that on display? Or do you see a person that only hangs out with an elite group of people and hides out in a green room before service and all these sorts of things, right? And just ask yourself, how should it be? How would Jesus have led? And he lays it right out for us right there, doesn't he? I mean, the Pharisees were more interested in creating clones of themselves than followers of Jesus. Followers of their teachings is what they were after, rather than people who truly were serving God. And they used spiritually abusive mechanisms to force people into submission. Some of you have experienced situations like this, communities of faith, where everyone looked the part, but behind the suits and the handshakes were backstabbing hypocrites who saw the sin of others but were unable to see it in themselves. Maybe you found yourself on the treadmill of self-improvement, never quite measuring up to an ever-increasing standard. No matter how much you volunteered, it wasn't enough. No matter how much you gave, it wasn't enough. Perhaps people even tried to shame you into behaving a certain way or guilt you, check this out, guilt you into godliness.
Ooh, that's good.
But that's not how Jesus taught us to lead, because healthy spiritual leadership, I want you to hear this, is marked by guiding, not guilting people into action. People will be shown how to, not shoved into following Jesus. And the New Testament, Jesus offers us a picture of how true spiritual leaders should operate. John 10:14 says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. Paul the Apostle shares further insight, saying that a spiritual leader should be, and he lists out so many things. There's tons of scriptures here, but they're temperate, right? Which means what? That they're not hot-headed, right? They're self-controlled, they're upright, they're holy, they're disciplined, they're respectable, they're hospitable, they're able to teach, they're not overbearing, they're not quick-tempered, they're not violent, but they're gentle, they're not quarrelsome, they're not a lover of money, right? Peter emphasizes that they shouldn't be domineering over those in their care. 1 Peter in chapter 5, verse 3, right? Healthy spiritual leaders will never use spiritual language to coerce us into an activity that is not biblical. They won't nitpick our every move. It doesn't matter how you look or how cool you dress or how hip your clothes are. They don't build cultures of classism. They don't have the haves and have-nots because they've realized that we're all have-nots.
That's right.
They won't ask us to make financial gifts to the church in lieu of providing food to our own children. They'll be honest. They'll be trustworthy. They'll have wisdom, not just clever sounding sound bites that look great on Instagram.
Wow.
They may challenge us, but they'll do so with grace and truth, not judgment and condemnation. And spiritual leaders, as I've said many times on this, they are human. Jenny and I, we are these spiritual leaders. We are human. We will make mistakes. Sometimes they won't even be mistakes. Sometimes we'll purposely, knowingly walk into a sin, just like every human being. However, we should be good shepherds who lay down our lives rather than using people that we serve to build a platform for ourselves to stand on. But it's not always super easy, right? And there's some people probably hearing this and thinking, what?
Some of you might be hearing us describe these unhealthy spiritual leaders, and you're cheering us on right now because maybe you really resonate with that. You've experienced that. But let's slow down for a moment and clarify something. I want to make sure to check a box that's extremely critical and something that I think is starting to become mislabeled as spiritual abuse. When we describe some of the examples of spiritual abuse, we are not speaking about the act of sanctification that all Christians should experience.
Yeah.
Now, if you aren't familiar with this term, sanctification is simply the process of being made holy or more like Christ over our lifetime. For the Christian person, this process includes correction sometimes, accountability all the time, and discipleship all the time, all of which are truly good and productive activities. As a Christian, we believe that we are literally commanded to edify, and that is to instruct and advise and build up one another, to edify the church. Now, if you're around me much, you'll often hear me say that we can't be the best version of ourselves by ourselves. We both say that. We have to be willing to let others challenge us without getting offended. I don't consider all voices of accountability and spiritual guidance to be traumatic or abusive, right? Just because someone doesn't affirm our choices doesn't mean that they're gaslighting us, hurting us, or abusing us. In fact, they may actually be speaking the truth. And that truth may not fit in with the trends in culture or with what makes us feel good, right? We don't follow our feelings. We follow the truth. There are times when we do need to submit to a spiritual authority in our lives. There are times when our parents, our pastors, our brothers and sisters in Christ truly do know better, and we'd be wise to heed their advice. I am fully supportive of and participant in healthy accountability and discipleship.
Yeah, amen.
It isn't spiritual abuse simply because they're calling us to a higher standard. It only becomes abuse when they do it without grace. It becomes abuse when there are strings attached, or when their love for us is contingent upon man-made rules, when accountability and discipleship becomes a tool of oppression or control. That's when it needs to be stopped. But the question is how? How can we stop it? Or if we've already been a victim of it, how can we heal? In the next episode, we're going to get into the really practical things that we can do to confront spiritual abuse and to heal from it without losing our faith. Make sure to finish this journey with us because the hopeful healing part is coming up next.
And as always, if you're getting a lot out of this, head over, get the course on My Reboot, share it with some people, get involved in this, and help other people heal, right? You can go do that. You'll see discussion questions and all kinds of good stuff. Thanks again for joining us for the session 3, right?
Yep.
Session 3 of the Great Cover Up. We're Evan and Jenny. Well, I guess I'm Evan, she's Jenny. And until next time, please keep moving forward as we overcome trauma together.